In May of 2019, Detective Steve Smith sat in front of a computer screen in Toronto and received an email that changed the outcome of a case that had been unsolved for 35 years. The email contained a list of names, not suspects, not matches in the way a fingerprint is a match. What it contained was something far more subtle and far more powerful. A cascade of genetic relatives, people connected by blood to an unknown killer, through lineages that stretched backward through generations and across databases ordinary people had built while searching for their own family trees. The case was Christine Jessup, a 9-year-old girl who had disappeared on October 3, 1984, from a farmhouse north of Toronto, who had been found 3 months later in a wooded ravine, whose murder had consumed 2 trials, destroyed an innocent man's life, sparked a provincial inquiry, and defeated every investigative tool available to Canadian law enforcement for the better part of 4 decades. And now, in 2019, it would be solved not by the criminal databases that police had built and refined over decades, but by the ancestry websites that ordinary people used to find distant cousins. Smith had attended a seminar at the Ontario Police College. The subject was forensic genetic genealogy, a technique so new to Canadian police work that most departments had never heard of it. The idea was deceptively simple. Take a sample of degraded DNA from a crime scene. Run it not against a criminal database, which contained only people already arrested or convicted. Run it instead against a genealogy database, the kind where hundreds of thousands of ordinary people had uploaded their genetic information, hoping to learn where they came from. Then build a family tree. The degraded sample from Christine Jessup's crime scene had been sitting in evidence storage for 35 years. It had survived the era when DNA testing was impossible. It had survived the conviction of an innocent man. It had survived the exoneration that followed. Nobody had ever decided to simply try a different approach. Smith reached out to Aram Incorporated, a forensic genomics laboratory based in Houston, Texas. The fee was approximately $1,800 American dollars for a case that had already cost countless hours of police work, endless interviews, a false conviction, a public inquiry, and a provincial compensation settlement that approached $1.3 million. $1,800 seemed almost trivial. It was the smallest investment imaginable. The degraded forensic sample was sequenced using methods capable of reading hundreds of thousands of genetic markers. This was far beyond what standard forensic testing could accomplish. The resulting profile was uploaded to GEDmatch, a genealogy database platform, the same kind of tool that ordinary people used when they wanted to find long-lost relatives or connect with distant branches of their family tree. The first search returned approximately 33,000 possible genetic relatives. 33,000 people connected by blood to whoever had killed Christine Jessup. A second search, run through a different genealogy platform, narrowed that number to somewhere around 400. 400 people still felt like an ocean. What Smith was searching for he would later call the golden goose, a parent, a sibling, a child of the unknown killer. Someone close enough to the killer in the family tree that the entire structure would collapse inward quickly, revealing a name. He did not find that. What he found instead was months of meticulous genealogical work. A forensic genealogist named Anthony Redgrave took the list of distant genetic cousins and began the painstaking process of building a family tree backward through generations. Generation by generation, line by line, the branches converged on a single common ancestor. A man named Henry Hoover Jr., born in 1804 in Lennox, Ontario. From there, the work moved forward again. Forward through time, forward through generations, narrowing an enormous possible family tree down toward a single name. It would take months of work. But for the first time in 35 years, Someone was finally looking in the right direction. Christine Marion Jessup was born on November 29, 1974, in Queensville, Ontario, a small rural community, roughly an hour's drive north of Toronto. The kind of place where most families knew each other by name, where front doors were left unlocked, where children rode their bicycles until the streetlights came on, and parents did not think twice about it, because nothing bad had ever happened there. She had sharp, quick features, a face full of freckles, the kind of restless energy that made her impossible to keep indoors on a nice day. She was a tomboy who also kept a stuffed rabbit on her bed. She loved baseball. She loved bike riding. She loved climbing anything that could be climbed. Above all, she loved animals. She had a beagle named Freckles. According to her mother, Janet, she once found a bat that had flown into her bedroom, and where anyone else would have screamed, Christine wanted to keep it as a pet. She talked about growing up to be a veterinarian, not as a casual childhood dream, but as something she believed in with absolute certainty. Her older brother, Ken, was 5 years her senior. He looked out for her the way older brothers do, half annoyance, half devotion. The Jessup family was quiet and unremarkable. They were not untouched by difficulty. Christine's father, Bob, was not home that October. He was serving a short sentence at the Toronto East Detention Centre for misappropriating funds from a relative. It is not the center of this story, but it explains why on October 3rd, Janet and Ken had plans to visit him in the city. Plans that would leave Christine alone in the house for a short stretch of time. On the morning of October 3rd, 1984, Christine was upset. She wanted to come to Toronto with her mother and brother. She was told she was too young for where they were going. She lost the argument. She got on the school bus anyway, the way she always did. At school that day, in music class, she was handed a small plastic recorder with her name written on a strip of paper taped to the side. It was an ordinary object, a woodwind instrument every child in that decade remembers learning to play. She carried it home with her, proud of it, planning to show it off. Her school day ended in the early afternoon. She took the bus home as always and was dropped off a short distance from her house. Sometime close to 4 o'clock, she let herself inside. She brought in the mail. She set down her backpack. Using a nickel she found in a jar of loose change, she walked to the corner store near her home to buy a piece of gum. The shopkeeper would later tell investigators she came in alone sometime between 3:30 and 4 o'clock, bought her gum, and left within a minute. She was supposed to meet her friend Leslie at a nearby park after that. Leslie arrived. Christine never did. At around 4:10 in the afternoon, Janet and Ken pulled into the driveway, back from their trip into the city. And here is where the picture started to feel wrong. The mail was inside, the backpack was on the counter, but Christine's red bicycle, the bike she treated like a prized possession, was lying on the ground. Its kickstand bent beneath it. Her jacket was hanging on a hook far too high for her to reach on her own. Someone had been inside that house after Christine came home. Someone tall enough and comfortable enough to hang up a 9-year-old's coat as if they lived there. By 5 o'clock, with still no sign of her daughter, Janet walked to the park. She called the homes of every friend Christine had. Each call came back the same. Nobody had seen her. By early evening, Janet called the police. What followed consumed the resources of the York Regional Police. Hundreds of volunteers walked shoulder to shoulder, through open fields, through ditches, through wooded margins, told not to leave any gaps. Divers searched nearby ponds. Missing person flyers went up across the region. Day after day, the search turned up nothing. Not a shoe, not a scrap of clothing, nothing at all. On New Year's Eve, 1984, a man named Fred Patterson went looking for his dog on a wooded property outside the town of Sunderland, roughly 55 kilometers east of Queensville. Walking with his two daughters along a half-dug pit near a trail, he saw what he thought was a pile of garbage. It was Christine. The post-mortem revealed she had suffered multiple severe injuries. She had been subjected to a violent physical attack. Investigators recovered fragments of the clothing she had worn that day. A single hair caught in the clasp of her necklace. And something else. Something that would not mean anything for another 36 years. Degraded genetic material. Foreign DNA preserved on her clothing. Beside her body, in the tall grass, they found her recorder. The one with her name written on it. The one she had been so proud of on the last ordinary day of her life. Because Christine's body was found across regional lines, the case shifted to Durham Regional Police. What happened next marked the beginning of a second tragedy. One that would unfold not in the ravine where she was discovered, but in the hands of investigators who were certain they knew what they were looking for. In 1984, DNA fingerprinting, as we understand it today, essentially did not exist. The biological evidence recovered from Christine's body could only be tested using basic blood grouping, a method so broad that it could rule out almost no one. The single piece of evidence capable of identifying her real killer, that degraded genetic material, that foreign DNA preserved on her clothing, was for the moment useless. Science simply had not caught up to the crime. With no forensic path forward, investigators did something that desperate investigators have done in cases before and since. They stopped looking for evidence. They started looking for a person who simply felt wrong to them. The lead detective on the case, Robert Brown, reportedly split his investigators into two competing teams and made it known that whichever team produced a viable suspect first would take over the case. Think about what that does to an investigation. It does not reward patience. It does not reward thoroughness. It rewards speed. Two detectives, Bernie Fitzpatrick and John Shepard, known around the department as Fitz and Shep, took up that challenge. They inherited boxes of notes, compiled by the original York Regional Police. In those boxes, according to later investigation, sat the name of a family friend connected to the Jessups through his wife. That name was set aside, dismissed as the work of an amateur department that, in their view, had not known what it was doing. It would not surface again for 36 years. Here is what Fitz and Shep did not know they were walking past. In the earliest weeks of the investigation, other names came and went. A family friend known for making dark, unsettling comments. A neighborhood boy who carried a knife. For a brief period, even Janet Jessup herself was quietly looked at. None of it led anywhere. But once tunnel vision begins, once investigators decide that speed matters more than direction, the investigation moves with a kind of gravity all its own. Certain names stay, others vanish. The reasons often have little to do with evidence. On February 14, 1985, the investigation turned toward a man who lived next door to the Jessups. His name was Guy Paul Moran. He was 24 years old. He worked as a furniture factory worker. He was quiet. He kept bees. He played the clarinet in a small community band. He lived at home with his parents. And here is the uncomfortable truth about how he became a suspect. It was not physical evidence. It was not a broken alibi. It was a single line from Janet Jessup describing him as, in her words, a weird type of guy. Moran had not joined the search parties for Christine. He had not attended her funeral. To the detectives working the case, that silence read as guilt. Here is what those detectives did not know, or did not want to know. Moran had a time card. Records showed he punched out of his job in Newmarket at 3:32 in the afternoon on October 3rd. A job located roughly 57 kilometers from his home. Simple mathematics said he could not have reached Queensville before approximately 4:14. His own family placed his arrival home even later, somewhere between 5 and 5:30. Janet and Ken, remember, had returned home at 4:10. The window for Moran to have intercepted Christine did not exist, not on paper. So investigators went back to the one part of the timeline that was not fixed. Over repeated conversations that should never have happened the way they did, Janet's memory of that afternoon began to shift. What had started as a clear 4:10 arrival slowly stretched under sustained and gentle pressure toward somewhere between 4:20 and 4:35. A window that had not existed now did. A few weeks later, an undercover officer introduced to Moran through his community band as a hairdressing student needing samples for a class project collected a strand of his hair. It was sent to a forensic scientist who examined it under a microscope next to a hair recovered from the clasp of Christine's necklace. The two hairs were, in the scientist's words, microscopically similar and consistent. What almost nobody explained to the jury that would later hear this evidence was what those words actually meant. Microscopic hair comparison cannot identify a specific person. At best, it can exclude someone who obviously does not match. It cannot say, "This hair belongs to this man." It can only say, "This hair could belong to someone who shares certain characteristics." It is not a fingerprint. It is closer to a coin flip dressed up in a lab coat. Millions of people could have hair microscopically consistent with a given sample. The scientist was not lying, but the courtroom was not told what the testimony actually meant. Fibers recovered from Moran's car were presented as proof that Christine had been inside it. Years later, it would come out that the lab technician handling those fibers had been wearing a red sweater during testing. Not a lab coat, in a shared space where cross-contamination was entirely possible, where fibers from the technician's own clothing could transfer to evidence without anyone's knowledge. A cigarette butt recovered near the crime scene simply disappeared from the evidence file. Moran did not smoke. An officer who had worked the original crime scene was later found to have kept two separate sets of notes, one of them rewritten in a way that better suited the case against Moran. What would you have done? If you were the jury, if you were told hair was consistent, fibers matched, an innocent man's timeline kept shifting, where would your suspicion have landed? Investigators brought in a behavioral profile from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The profile described a white male between 19 and 26 years old, likely local to Queensville, possibly isolated or withdrawn. It was presented to the press with certain details omitted. Details that, by some accounts, did not comfortably fit Guy Paul Moran at all. Here is the detail that nobody said out loud at the time. That same profile technically excluded a 28-year-old man living in Scarborough, a man named Calvin Hoover. But Calvin Hoover's name was not in the investigative file yet. He would not surface for 36 years, and by then, another man would have spent years in prison for a crime he did not commit. Guy Paul Moran was arrested on April 22, 1985, on his way to band practice. He was charged with first-degree murder. His first trial began in January of 1986 in London, Ontario. His defense, facing an already thin body of evidence, made an unusual choice. They introduced psychiatric testimony. They argued that Moran suffered from schizophrenia, that even if the evidence somehow implicated him, he could not be held criminally responsible for his actions. On February 7, 1986, the jury acquitted him. That should have been the end of it. It was not. The Crown appealed the verdict, arguing that the trial judge had misdirected the jury on the burden of proof. In June of 1987, the Ontario Court of Appeal ordered a new trial, a decision the Supreme Court of Canada upheld in November of 1988. At Moran's second trial, the Crown leaned harder on forensic testimony. They brought in two jailhouse informants, men with their own histories of dishonesty, men with their own reasons to want favor from the Crown. These men testified that Moran had confessed to them in custody. One of them told the court that Moran had described committing the murder using a phrase borrowed from a horror film he had recently seen, a phrase about redoing or redumbing the innocent. It sounded damning in a courtroom. It was, in truth, nothing more than a mangled reference to a movie Moran had mentioned watching, a film he had discussed casually with someone he thought was a fellow inmate. Years later, when investigators questioned that informant again, he admitted something different. He had been hoping his testimony would shorten his own sentence. He could no longer be certain of what he had actually heard in that cell. He could no longer be certain he had heard anything at all. At the time of the trial, none of that uncertainty reached the jury. A psychologist also testified. She told the court that Moran's own parents, who insisted their son had not arrived home until well after Christine disappeared, were not telling the truth so much as protecting him. This was, the psychologist suggested, part of a closed-off, secretive family system, a psychological pattern of denial, of loyalty overriding honesty. There was no evidence for that claim beyond the fact that the family loved their son and believed he was innocent. But the psychologist's testimony planted a seed. It suggested that the family's belief in Moran was not trustworthiness. It was complicity. On July 30th, 1992, Guy Paul Moran was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. He had spent roughly a decade under the weight of a murder prosecution. He had been acquitted once, and the Crown had brought him back to trial anyway. The system had decided it knew better than a jury. Here is what nobody in that courtroom knew. A method of genetic testing called polymerase chain reaction, PCR, was just beginning to enter forensic use. It was about to do what microscopic hair comparison and contaminated fibers never could. It was capable of amplifying tiny amounts of degraded genetic material into an individualized DNA profile. A profile so precise that it could identify a specific person, not suggest one might match. It was about to prove that every piece of forensic evidence presented against Guy Paul Moran was either contaminated, misinterpreted, or meaningless. But that technology did not exist yet in any practical sense during his trial. The science that would exonerate him was still being developed in laboratories he had never heard of. He was convicted by the science available in 1992, and he would be exonerated by the science available in 1995. 3 years stood between his conviction and his freedom. But those 3 years would not be the worst of it. He had been tried twice. He had been convicted once. He had spent 18 months in prison. He had lost a decade of his life to a case that consumed him completely. He had watched his family suffer under the weight of his prosecution, and he had done nothing wrong. This is what tunnel vision produces. Not justice, not closure, not answers for a family still searching for their daughter's killer. This is what happens when investigation becomes about conviction instead of truth. When speed matters more than certainty. When the machinery of the system keeps moving forward, even after its own evidence has begun to crumble. The case against Guy Paul Moran was not built on reasonable doubt. It was built on the absence of reasonable certainty, on the absence of anyone better to blame. And it would take 3 more years of scientific advancement to undo what had taken only weeks to construct. In January of 1995, joint testing between Ontario's Centre of Forensic Sciences and an independent laboratory produced a conclusive genetic profile from the crime scene evidence, recovered more than a decade earlier. The profile excluded Guy Paul Moran completely. On January 23, 1995, the Ontario Court of Appeal set aside his conviction and formally acquitted him. He had spent 18 months in prison. He had endured 2 trials. He had lost roughly a decade of his life under the weight of a murder prosecution for a crime he did not commit. In a public statement, Moran said this: I am relieved for Christine's mother, Janet, and her family, and I hope this will give them some peace of mind. When DNA exonerated me in January of 1995, I was sure that one day DNA would reveal the real killer. And now it has. That last sentence would haunt the case for decades. Now it had not. On January 24, 1997, the government of Ontario awarded Moran and his parents $1.25 million in compensation. It was the largest wrongful conviction settlement the province had issued to that point. It could not return the decade. It could not restore the years taken from him. But it acknowledged that something had gone profoundly wrong. The province ordered a public inquiry led by retired Judge Fred Kaufman. The hearings began in February of 1997 and ran for 146 days. They heard testimony from 120 witnesses. They reviewed more than 100,000 pages of documents. Every piece of evidence was examined. Every decision was questioned. Every investigator was asked to explain what they had done and why. When the Kaufman report was released in April of 1998, it ran to 1,380 pages, across 2 volumes, and made 19 recommendations. Its central finding was blunt. Investigators had displayed, in Kaufman's own words, tunnel vision of the most staggering proportions. Kaufman traced the investigation step by step, the competing detective teams rewarding speed over patience, the timeline manipulation under interrogation pressure, the dismissal of evidence that did not fit the theory already taking shape, the jailhouse informants and their undisclosed incentives, the contaminated fibers and the misinterpreted hair comparison, the FBI profile that was presented selectively to the press, omitting details that did not match the suspect they had already chosen. He summarized the entire tragedy in a single line that has followed this case ever since. An innocent person was convicted of a heinous crime he did not commit. Science helped convict him. Science exonerated him. Janet Jessup sat through that inquiry. She listened to investigators explain their decisions. She heard the evidence examined and re-examined. And when she was asked to testify, she said something that has stayed with everyone who has studied this case since. This inquiry, she said, was not about Christine. It was about Mr. Moran. She was right. For 13 years, the focus of the investigation, the trial system, and the exoneration process had not been on finding who killed her daughter. It had been on proving, or disproving, the guilt of a man who played the clarinet and kept bees, and happened to live next door to a crime. The real killer had been invisible throughout all of it. While Moran was arrested, tried, convicted, imprisoned, and exonerated, the person who actually murdered Christine Jessup was living his life somewhere. Working, sleeping, moving through the world with the knowledge of what he had done. And after 13 years, after 2 trials, after a public apology and over $1 million in compensation, the Jessup family still did not know who had murdered their daughter. For years, the case went cold again. In 1995, jurisdiction passed to the Toronto Police Service, who assembled a 9-person task force. They interviewed more than 300 people. They collected DNA elimination samples from dozens of men. None of it produced a match. By the late 1990s, the task force disbanded. The file was handed to a cold case unit where it sat, reopened periodically, chased down through hundreds of tips over the following decades without ever producing a name. 35 years passed this way. 35 years of Christine's killer walking free while an innocent man carried the weight of her murder through his life. And then, in May of 2019, someone finally looked in the right place. Jurisdiction passed to the Toronto Police Service in 1995. They assembled a 9-person task force dedicated to Christine Jessup's case. These were investigators who knew they were starting from zero. Guy Paul Moran was innocent. The real killer was still out there. The case was, in every meaningful sense, at the beginning again. They interviewed more than 300 people. They collected DNA elimination samples from dozens of men. They chased leads and followed theories, and worked with a dedication that the original investigation had not possessed. But the degraded DNA sample from Christine's body, while now testable with PCR technology, still produced only limited results. It could exclude certain individuals, but a match required someone in the database to compare it to. And the database only contained people who had already been arrested or convicted. The real killer had never been arrested. He had never been convicted. There was no reason for him to be in that database. The science was no longer the limitation. The limitation was that they had nowhere to look. By the late 1990s, the task force disbanded. The file was handed to a cold case unit where it sat, periodically reopened, periodically chased. Hundreds of tips came in over the following decades, each one investigated, each one leading nowhere. By 2015, the case had been unsolved for 30 years. By 2018, for 34. The original investigators were retiring. The family was aging. The likelihood of resolution seemed to recede with each passing year. And then, in May of 2019, Detective Steve Smith attended a seminar at the Ontario Police College. The subject was forensic genetic genealogy. It was a technique barely used anywhere in Canada. Most police departments had never heard of it. Most forensic scientists had never tried it. But Smith recognized immediately what it could mean for cases like Christine's. The principle was different from anything law enforcement had attempted before. Do not search a criminal database. Search a genealogy database. The kind ordinary people used when they wanted to find long-lost relatives or trace their family history. Millions of people had uploaded their genetic information to platforms like Deadmatch or Ancestry DNA. Most of them were looking for family connections. They had no idea they had also created, in aggregate, a tool that could eventually solve cold cases. Smith reached out to Aram Incorporated in Houston, Texas. The fee was approximately $1,800. For a case that had already consumed decades and millions in investigative resources, it was a reasonable gamble. The degraded sample from Christine's body was sequenced using advanced methods capable of reading hundreds of thousands of genetic markers. This was exponentially more detailed than standard forensic DNA testing. Standard forensic testing typically examines 13 to 20 markers. This examination looked at hundreds of thousands, every variant that could be detected, every genetic signature that could be extracted from those degraded decades-old fibers. That profile was uploaded to Deadmatch. The first search returned approximately 33,000 possible genetic relatives. 33,000 people connected by blood to the unknown killer. A second search, through a different genealogy platform, narrowed that number to somewhere around 400. One senior officer would later explain it this way: "This is not a fingerprint match. It provides a potential family lineage from a DNA sample, and then it becomes the work of a police investigator to build out from that potential lineage, through interviews, through historical records, through old newspaper archives, until a family tree takes shape." A forensic genealogist named Anthony Redgrave took on that work. Month after month, he traced lines of descent backward through generations. Generation by generation, the branches converged on a common ancestor, a man named Henry Hoover Jr., born in 1804 in Lennox, Ontario. From there, the work moved forward again, branch by branch, generation by generation, narrowing an enormous possible family tree down toward a single name. The investigation that had stalled for 35 years was finally moving in the right direction. Anthony Redgrave was a forensic genealogist. His job was to take the 400 possible genetic relatives and transform them into a family tree that made sense. Not speculation, not theory. Lineage. Documented connections between generations, birth records, marriage records, death certificates. The paper trail that connects people to one another. He began with the common ancestor, Henry Hoover, Jr., born in 1804. From there, he worked forward through time, branch by branch, generation by generation. Each branch represented a possibility. Each person in each generation could be the source of the DNA profile. Each person could be the killer. But most of them could not. They were too old, or too young, or living in the wrong place, or had died decades before Christine's murder. Redgrave eliminated them methodically. The tree began to narrow. Dozens of possibilities became dozens. Dozens became dozens. And then, slowly, the branches began to converge on a smaller and smaller pool of names. The genealogical work was paired with investigative work. Police checked interviews. They consulted historical records. They searched old newspaper archives. They looked at employment records and residence histories. Who lived where in 1984? Who would have had the physical capability and access? Who matched the genetic profile when all the branches were followed to their logical conclusion? A name began to appear with increasing frequency in the family tree. Calvin Hoover. He was born in 1956. That made him 28 years old, on October 3, 1984. He lived in Scarborough, roughly 20 kilometers from Queensville. He was employed, he had a residence, he had a history in the region. And here is what matters. He had never appeared as a serious suspect in the original investigation. The FBI profile, you remember, had described a white male between 19 and 26 years old. Calvin Hoover was 28. The profile, as presented to the press, did not comfortably accommodate a man of that age. And so, even though the profile's omitted details apparently left room for older suspects, the investigators working the case had not pursued him. He had been ruled out by a framework that was never fully explained to the public, by criteria that were never made explicit in the investigation, by a system that made sense to investigators at the time but excluded the person who actually committed the crime. For 35 years, Calvin Hoover had lived with the knowledge of what he had done. Police began the work of gathering evidence, not from genealogy databases now, from the physical world. They approached his residence. They conducted interviews. They collected DNA samples. They built a case not on ancestry but on biology, on the genetic material that had been preserved on Christine's clothing for 35 years. The testing was conclusive. The degraded DNA from Christine Jessup's crime scene matched Calvin Hoover, not through genealogy, through direct comparison. There was no ambiguity, no microscopic similarity, no coin flip dressed in a lab coat. This was the kind of match that excluded everyone else on the planet except the person who left that evidence. 35 years after Christine was murdered. 35 years after an innocent man was convicted in his place. 35 years after the Kaufman inquiry documented tunnel vision and systemic failure. The case had a name. If you're watching this and you've made it this far, you know what this case cost, what it took to solve it, and what it says about how we investigate, how we prosecute, and how we verify the truths we believe we have found. Subscribe if you haven't already. Share this with someone who needs to understand how fragile justice can be. And tell us, where are you watching from tonight? Why did this case take 35 years and a consumer DNA database to solve? The answer is not simple. It involves the state of forensic science in 1984. It involves the institutional pressures that pushed investigators toward speed instead of certainty. It involves the fact that the only evidence capable of identifying the real killer was incomprehensible to the technology available at the time. But it also involves something harder to measure. It involves the moment when investigation became about conviction, when finding the guilty person mattered less than convicting someone. When the machinery of the system kept moving forward, even after its own evidence had begun to fail. Microscopic hair comparison looked scientific in 1992. It sounded like evidence. It came from a laboratory and was presented by an expert, but it could not actually identify a specific person. The system did not have the honesty to say that clearly. The jury did not have the information to understand it, and a man went to prison for a crime he did not commit. That is not a failure of science. That is a failure of how science was communicated, how it was used, how it was allowed to masquerade as certainty when it was nothing of the kind. Between 1984 and 2019, forensic technology transformed. DNA fingerprinting emerged. PCR amplification allowed the testing of degraded samples. Genealogy databases grew to contain millions of genetic profiles. And, crucially, someone had the insight to ask whether those genealogy databases could be used for law enforcement purposes. No one was required to ask that question. It was not obvious. Most police departments did not ask it. Most forensic scientists did not think to ask it. It took an individual detective, Steve Smith, attending a seminar and recognizing a possibility that no one had yet explored in Canadian law enforcement. That is how old cases get solved. Not through inevitable technological progress, through someone making a choice to look differently. The human cost of those 35 years cannot be measured precisely. Guy Paul Moran spent 18 months in prison for a crime he did not commit. He spent a decade under prosecution. He was exonerated. He received compensation. But the decade is gone. It cannot be returned. Janet Jessup waited 35 years to know who killed her daughter. 35 years wondering. 35 years watching investigators pursue the wrong person. 35 years watching that person's life be destroyed while her daughter's killer remained free. When they finally arrested Calvin Hoover, it brought closure. But it did not bring back the years. It did not undo the injustice to Moran. It did not restore what had been lost. Genetic genealogy has changed cold case investigation. Dozens of cases have been solved through the same technique that solved Christine Jessup's murder. But the technology raises questions we have not yet answered. If someone uploads their DNA to a genealogy database, they have consented to having their genetic information used to find long-lost relatives. They have not consented to law enforcement access. They have not consented to having their family members investigated because of genetic coincidence. These are not simple questions. The benefit, solving cold cases, bringing killers to justice, is real. But the cost, in terms of privacy and in terms of families being investigated for crimes committed by distant relatives, is also real. Christine Jessup's case was solved. Her killer is in custody. But the case also stands as a monument to how long justice can take, how fragile it can be, how easily it can fail. Subscribe, share this story, because cases like this one need to be remembered, not as victories for the system, but as reminders of how much further we need to go.